Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen of YouTube. I'm Chucky2009. I'm here in my shop with this brand new air compressor I just went and bought last night because I've been planning to upgrade for a while. And y'all know I do a fair amount of plasma cutting, and I'm going to be getting into some other applications that require a lot of air. And I have somewhat of an understanding about what you want in a air compressor you're going to be using for plasma cutting or similar applications. But I'm really lucky. I have my buddy Jim Colt here today. Jim, what's your background? I think you said you used a plasma cutter once or twice before, right?
Yeah, a couple times. I've been with Hypertherm 38 years in a variety of different positions, and you'll catch me on a lot of the online forums and so forth. But let's talk about compressors.
Yeah, definitely. So, I'm gonna warn you guys, it's gonna be a pretty long video because we want this to be very in depth. We want to talk about a lot of stuff. And I got this list of talking points here, and Jim knows a lot about a lot of things, including air compressors. So, you ready to get started?
Let's go.
So, Jim, if you were someone who is looking to get into plasma cutting, what size, basically, of compressor would you recommend they look for?
Okay, well, like with everything else, bigger is better, right? So,
yeah.
So just get the biggest compressor you can, but
what can go wrong?
That doesn't always work.
Yeah.
So you really have to size it. If you've got for instance, if you have a smaller plasma cutter, it's going to use less air than a larger one. Simple as that. Mm-hmm. So the best thing to do, if you've got a PowerMax 30 XL from Hypertherm, XP from Hypertherm, look in the manual. Right in the specs page, it's going to tell you what the flow rate and the pressure is, and usually it's SCFM, which is standard cubic feet per minute, at 90 psi is the numbers you want to compare. And I think on that it's 4.5 SCFM at 90
Something
psi.
like that, yeah.
So you want to, if you buy a compressor that's exactly the same rating as that, and you cut continuously, expect the compressor to run continuously.
Yeah.
So if you buy one that's twice the size, the compressor's going to cycle on and off. That's what you need to think about.
So what's really cool is what kind of air did you say the PowerMax 45 requires?
The 45 is, if I remember correctly, 6.0 SCFM.
So about 6 CFM. This compressor, what does this thing say it is? Let's see, 12.8 at 90 psi. Earlier, we used this on the CNC table. We used this to power the compressor that's hooked up to the CNC table. And last night, before I bought this compressor, we were just using the little old Makita over there, which is awesome for its size, but it doesn't put out that much air. And last night, when we were cutting out these cooking grates for a barbecue I'm building, we could only cut, what do you think, Jim?
5 or 6 of the
five or six of the little slots in it. Then we'd have to stop. Jim was over by the CNC table. I was over by the air compressor watching the gauges, and we knew the compressor would shut itself off for lack of air at about 60 psi or so, a little over, right?
The plasma cutter, not the compressor.
The plasma cutter would shut off about 60 psi. So we'd get close to that and be like, Jim, stop! And he'd wait till we were at a good stopping point, like at the end of his slot, and he'd like mash the button.
So it literally took us 4 times as long just to cut the part.
And then it'd go back up and I'd yell at him. So with this thing, this morning, and this is pretty cool, we're cutting and we drained the compressor tank down quite a bit with that, and then the compressor kicked on. It not only produced as much air, because this thing puts out twice the CFH or CFM of what the plasma cutter takes. You know, it would run to the point where it filled itself back up, and then it would stop, and then we'd cut for several minutes or so it felt. I didn't really time it, and then it'd come right back down. Alright, so once you've figured out approximately what size of air compressor you might be in the market for, are there any like tips or tricks or anything you can recommend someone do to get the most out of their unit for plasma cutting in particular?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of little tips for the plasma cutter. Once again, you got to go back to the manual, look at the specs. It's really critical that the inlet pressure to the plasma cutter stays constant and stays. Most plasma cutters like to have between 90 and 120 psi on the inlet.
Okay.
If you go below that, the plasma cutters eventually, somewhere down around 65, 70 psi, the cutter is going to shut itself off if the pressure drops below that. But if it stays constant at 90 to 100 psi, the cut quality will stay more consistent. Everything will work better for you.
And if a person acquires a Hypertherm, are they going to have to screw with a little knob like on the back of the machine that like screws on there? Or do some of your units have like automatic pressure regulators or something and an LED LED panel on the front of the machine? How do these usually work?
Well, all of them have, all the hypertherm units do have a regulator inside, but some of them you have to manually adjust the pressure. Now there's two pressures for a plasma cutter too, and a lot of people don't think of this. There's inlet pressure, which is what comes out of the compressor. And then there's cut pressure, and that's the pressure that goes from the plasma cutter to the torch. And that's what you have to adjust with the onboard regulator. But yes, like you said, the newer, more modern hypertherm systems like the PowerMax 65, 85, 105, and 125 have auto air settings.
That's really nice.
As long as the inlet pressure stays above 90 psi, the cut pressure to the torch is automatically adjusted.
Yeah.
So.
The other thing is on my PowerMax 45, it's got a little LED regulator on the front of the machine. My regular viewers have seen me adjust this before. It's really easy. There's just, you want to keep the middle LED light lit, and you just adjust the regulator till it's at the perfect pressure. And in the different modes of the machine, like if you're gouging, it'll want much less air because you're not shooting through a piece of material. You're just going like part way into it. It will automatically adjust what it wants, and then you just turn the regulator. So it's a really simple system. There's not any math involved. There's really not even any real thought to it. You pretty much just do it. And I feel like that's one of the advantage of a lot of the hypertherm units, because some other units, some of the much cheaper ones, it's a lot more complicated and detailed to adjust.
And one point that I'd like to make sure is air pressure, there's a lot of high temperature physics that goes on inside the plasma torch.
I'm sure.
And so stick with the manufacturer specs on the cut air pressure and the inlet air pressure, because if you don't, a lot of people I've talked to over the years have said, well, if I can cut half-inch material at 60 psi cut pressure, God, what can I do at 90? And you turn it up. What that basically does is strips away the cooling effects, even though it's more pressure. It strips away the boundary layer of cool gas that protects the nozzle in the torch. And it'll cause your consumables to wear out real fast. It might cut good for a few milliseconds, but
and then they're gone. Yeah. So you guys spend a lot of time and money researching things like this and developing. You've got this whole plasma cutting thing down to pretty much a science at this point, right?
Yeah.
Cool.
Use the specs in the book. Works best.
Definitely. So I know just in terms of consumable life, I've heard a lot of people talk a lot about moisture and how that affects it. What can you tell us about that?
Yep. Well, with the hypertherm systems, and that's what I'm talking about most of the time because I'm a hypertherm guy. There's a lot of other plasma systems out there, as we all know.
Yeah.
But moisture affects them all a little differently. It really depends on the design of the torch, design of the power supply, and the gas delivery system. But what happens with almost all of them to some extent is when a little moisture gets in the air, it's no longer air. Now you've got water in it. Water's made of hydrogen and oxygen. And when it gets in the plasma torch in the high temperature, it's going to break down. There's going to be some hydrogen, there's going to be some oxygen. It's no longer air. And air is oxygen and nitrogen mixed together along with a few other tramp gases. So anyway, the torch was designed to cut with air. Now you've added some other contamination to it, and it's going to shorten the life of the consumables. And when it shortens the life of the consumables, it changes the shape of the orifice, shape of the electrode, and it's going to start cutting really ugly. The first thing you'll see is dross on the back of the cut. The second thing you sometimes see when you get a lot of moisture in your air is green flame coming out the front of the torch, and that's the consumables burning up and spitting themselves out.
Been there, done that. I mean, no, I haven't. So it sounds like this is a pretty precise thing, and it probably takes a lot of work and effort to keep that moisture level down, right?
Well, there's some, it kind of depends. It's kind of like everything else. It depends where you live. If you live in San Diego, the humidity level never gets very high. You probably don't have to do much of anything. If you live where I live in New Hampshire in the wintertime, the air is pretty dry. If the relative humidity where your compressor is located is relatively dry, you're not going to have much of a problem. But here we are in Texas, and I think if I come down here in July, you're going to open up the drain on the bottom of this tank, and you're probably going to spit out a couple cups of water every afternoon, right?
Definitely.
Well, when that water gets in the tank, it can get into the airline. So number one advice for everyone with a compressor, if you live in a humid climate or if it's that humid time of year, drain the tank daily. And the way that I do it, because I'm not real good at doing things daily like that, I put an auto drain on mine. They're available at, God, you can get them at
any big box store about, right?
Yep, there's some cheap ones. There's also some better ones that are electronic with a timer on them that every time the compressor cycles, they'll spit out all the water.
That's pretty cool.
That's the first thing you want to do.
Okay. So you're saying for all the science that goes into consumable life and quality consumables and torch design, you can really help yourself a lot just by draining the compressor.
That's
it.
Number one, first thing to do. But then, you know, we've all been in a shop during a humid season when maybe you're using an air hose to blow something off and you see a little mist come out of the air hose. When you see that, that's too much.
Yeah.
Okay.
Too much moisture.
I mean, there's a lot of things you can do after you drain the compressor if you still see that. One is, this is the luminizer filter that comes from Hypotherm. This is a beat up one that's been out in service for a little while, I believe. But it actually goes, you can mount it on the back of the plasma power supply, you can mount it on the output of the compressor. And what it does, it's got a particulate filter inside, it's got a coalescer. What a coalescer does is it takes the air and spins it like a centrifuge.
That's cool.
And so if there's particles of water in it, the water's heavier than the air, spins it to the outside, and then this thing on the bottom's an auto drain. It spits water out.
That's great.
There's also an indicator on the top when the particulate filter starts to get clogged. This will change from green to red. So this isn't the answer if you've got really high issues with a lot of moisture in your air, but it's good for most normal situations for plasma cutting and so forth. There's other ways to do it too. You go into any automotive paint shop where they use compressed air to push the paint out the gun.
Yeah.
You certainly don't want moisture in
No,
the paint.
that'd be bad.
We've all painted something, we got bubbles in the paint and orange peel. A lot of that can be attributed to moisture. So in the painting industry, they use something called a refrigerated air dryer.
Okay.
It's like a little 2x2 refrigerator, but what it does, it cools the air as it comes out of the compressor.
So the water condenses.
Yeah, and the water condenses, and then it runs through a coalescing filter, sort of like this.
So it's
that
really
spins
dry.
the larger water droplets out a lot easier, and then it spits it out a drain on the bottom down to the floor. And there are other types too. There's desiccant dryers. Those are used in paint shops. They're a little more expensive, a little more complex. Refrigerated air dryers, there are some that are reasonably priced, under $500 out there in the market that'll work for plasma cutting. You can look on Craigslist. Every once in a while a paint shop goes out of business. And you can buy
pick one up real cheap.
Yeah, or if you buy a good quality one from Granger's or someplace like that, it's going to cost you $1,000.
I bet. Another question. When I really want to go all out, if I know I'm going to be doing a lot of plasma cutting, if I'm taking on a big project with a lot of stuff I'm going to need to cut out, one of the things I'll do to prepare for that is to just blow some air out the air hose. Does moisture condense in the hose itself, or does that primarily happen in the tank?
Yeah, condenses wherever it gets to cool. This is the hottest spot because the compressor here actually heats the air up as it compresses it and increases the pressure, and so that heat gets into the tank, and so the heat is here. So every time when the air goes through a hose, it's going to cool down a little bit. When it cools, that causes the moisture to condense into larger droplets. And what happens, you might have a low spot in your hose. The water's going to...
It all goes in there.
So yeah, put an air hose on, just purge your lines a little bit, make sure your tank is drained. That's always a good thing to do before you're cutting, especially on a hot, humid summer day.
Without a doubt.
Yep.
Now, I don't have Jim Colt levels of experienced plasma cutting, but what I usually do is, like I said, before any large amount of plasma cutting, I drain the tank completely. I just open the thing up on the bottom and I let the compressed air in the tank blow out all the water. You get a big cloud of steam. Then I close it, let it charge back up, and then I'll just open up the end of my air hose. Sometimes I try to hold the hose out relatively straight, so hopefully the air just and the moisture just shoots out the ends, and that's worked pretty well for me. I know my consumable life could be better, but it's a hypertherm system, so even with the little bit of moisture I do have, I bet it still runs circles around some of the competitive offerings out there. What would you recommend? Would you say that type of deal that I just described would be fairly adequate for most people, or how do you feel about how I do that?
Well, there's certainly nothing wrong with that, and that's going to get the moisture out, but you're still generating heat. You're still cooling it as it goes through the hose, even after you do that. You may not have the big puddles of water, but it's going to get in the torch. And I started to mention a little bit earlier that some of the newer technology torches, the Duramax torch that we use on the newer 65, 85, our engineers designed it so that it's less susceptible to water. So when small traces of humidity get into the torch, it's not going to immediately destroy your consumables like it did with really older technology hypotherm systems and a lot of other brand systems that are out there in the market. So the torch design does make a difference, but
that's good.
Once again, let's try to get rid of the water. Let's not let it get in there if we can help it.
So myself, being made of money, what's something that I could potentially just pick up and add to my system? I've heard a little bit about those. I think they're called like motor guard filters or something.
That's a pretty good filter. A motor guard is a little aluminum housing with a filter element that goes in it that's pretty much the size of a roll of toilet paper. Don't use a roll of toilet paper.
Because I bet it like shreds and stuff, and you get pieces
breaks down in water, and it'll clog up your. So use the right filter element in those filters. But that's an absorbing filter. So what it actually does, it just sucks the water in, and once it gets saturated, it's not going to work anymore. It's going to clog up.
Clogs up.
The first thing you see often is maybe even an error code on your plasma cutter that says inadequate air pressure. And that's because under flowing conditions, you can't get enough flow through a clogged filter.
Sure.
And it'll give you an error code saying not enough air. So filters, and then I run into a lot of sites where the guy says, boy, if one filter's good, if I put 16 of them on there, it'll work a lot better. Every time you go through a filter, even if it's not clogged, there's a pressure drop that goes through there. So once the air starts flowing into plasma, it drops through the first filter and through all 16 of them. If you had 16, you're probably going to have air starvation at the plasma if you overfilter it. So you got to be careful with that.
All right. So what you're saying is don't do nothing. Definitely do something, and you can accomplish a lot just by draining your compressor and draining your air hose, but you get a lot of bonus points with a proper filter, correct? But if someone's just starting out and they just bought a plasma cutter and they went all out, they bought a pretty decent one, and they just bought an air compressor and they don't have all the money in the world, you can still do a lot just with draining these things out.
Exactly.
Okay,
As a minimum, that's what you got to do.
Definitely. That's really good. That's good to hear. What do you recommend in terms of using a hose or anything along those lines? Just some way to get air from the compressor to the plasma.
Yeah, because of the flow rate, the plasma cutter flows, a 45 amp, like a Hypertherm PowerMax 45 flows about the same as a 1/2-inch drive air impact wrench.
Okay, cool.
So it needs that much air. And to get that much air to it without too much pressure drop through the hose up to 50 feet long should be at least 3/8 of an inch inside diameter.
Okay.
That's about 10 millimeter if you're using metric hoses, I guess.
Sure.
So 50 feet. If you're over 50 feet long, we recommend going up a size to probably 1/2 inch inside diameter.
That's some big hose.
Good idea. And with the 1/2 inch, you could probably go 150 feet or longer if you needed to.
So what you're saying is, don't use those cute little curly Q like 1/4 inch deals that are supposed to be super handy if you're going to be doing any real quantity of plasma cutting.
Yeah, get a good hose, proper size. Once again, 3/8 is minimum, and over 50 feet long it needs to be, and that's the inside diameter, not some of those little curly Q. They're 3/8 outside diameter, I think.
So the other thing I'll add to what Jim's saying is, whatever you do, don't cheap out on an air hose. And Jim, you may or may not agree with this, but my experience was when I first moved to my last shop, I didn't bring an air compressor or anything with me, so I bought one, and I bought an El Cheapo, I don't even remember where I got it, it was just some store brand rubber air hose. The thing like cracked within a few months, and I replaced it with this one, which is a Goodyear brand, and it's been fine for 1.5 years now and counting. I just switched it over to this compressor this morning, and I saw no defects with it whatsoever after 1.5 years of use. And that's 1.5 years of it being, in the line of plasma sparks and being driven over with lots of stuff and that sort of thing. Yep. Would you recommend if a person, it really didn't even cost that much more, it was still pretty cheap, quite frankly. Would you say that if possible it's really best not to cheap out on an air hose like I did?
Yeah, go with the good stuff. And one good reason for that, have you ever seen something that's made of rubber that's left outside in the sunlight? The ultraviolet from the sunlight actually breaks it down, it cracks it and makes it weak. You're in a welding shop, in a plasma cutting shop, there's a lot of ultraviolet in here too. Probably more intense than the sunlight in most cases, and that can break down cheap hoses. So a hose that's designed for industrial use in a shop, good brand name, Goodyear is one, there's probably a lot of others. Gates. Make sure it's made for the application, and we recommend it. It's once again, like everything else, it costs a little more, but if it lasts 10 times as long
I think you get what you pay for.
Costs twice as much, it's cheaper.
It's cheaper in the long run. That's really good. I never thought about that. You got a lot of good insight on this stuff. What if a person wanted to go all out and rig up like some plumbing in their shop, like with some pipe or something? What would you say about that?
You can go online and kind of search shop air systems. There's companies like Sharp that builds all the components for compressed air systems, and others. And on their websites, they actually have some really good diagrams of a typical shop air system. But the bottom line is, think of the moisture in the airline. So what you kind of want to do, the very first thing when you come off the compressor, if you're going to do some hard plumbing, copper's a good way to go. Don't use regular PVC type water pipe. That has a tendency to, once again, break down under ultraviolet conditions, and when it does, it gets brittle, and the pressure from the air can cause it to explode, and then you've got little shrapnels of plastic.
Really bad.
There are some plastics that are made for air systems that you can use in shop. Just make sure it's specified for that. But the best thing is to run copper about a 20-foot length first out of the compressor, because copper is going to transfer heat really well, and it's going to cool down that air a lot better. At the end of that 20-foot section, put a coalescing filter, so you're going to spin the particles out and drain as much water as you can. You won't get it all. Then from there, there's other things that you really should do. You should always have the air lines up high in your shop, and the takeoff for the airline should be, for every airline, should be up on the top, because water's going to tend to fall down. Then you should have drop legs that go down with a drain at the bottom. If any water in any part of the system gets into those drop legs, if the water falls to the bottom, and you can periodically drain them.
Just open it up.
But there are some good diagrams you can find online. I'd recommend looking at them.
Sure. That's excellent. That's really good to know. At some point, I'm going to plumb this building for air. Don't know when. I'm just being honest, probably not for a while, but that is on my list of things to do.
I've had my shop back in New Hampshire for 34 years.
Yeah.
I got hoses draping across the floor still.
My man.
Don't do as I do as I say.
Do as we say. So, I know you said bigger is pretty much always better, and I can confirm that it is. But what if someone is just getting going and they just plain and simple can't afford this thing? So I went and bought this compressor for $799 last night, and I feel like it was a pretty good deal. I did some shopping around on the internet, and this seemed to be the thing to get. But by the time I left the store, I think I paid $943. That, of course, figures in sales tax. I had to get some cord, I had to get a plug, I got a fitting, all that random crap that adds up. So I'd say, conservatively, for something like this, if you don't have one, expect to spend about $1,000 or so, or a little bit less, or a little more, just depending on what you want. But what if you just bought a plasma cutter and you just don't have it, but you got something smaller like my little Makita over here, which, by the way, actually served me pretty well. What are your thoughts on using a smaller compressor with a plasma cutter, if that's all you got, or if that's all you can get in a certain situation?
Well, especially if you're in a kind of a small shop or a hobby situation where you're not doing plasma cutting 8 hours a day continuously.
Definitely.
All the plasma cutter cares is the inlet pressure stays. It should be above 90 psi. If it drops much below that, it'll keep cutting for a little while, and then the pressure switch internally is going to shut it down when it gets below 70. So what happens with a small compressor, small tank, smaller pump motor, things like that, is that it's going to be able to build up to 120 or more pounds per square inch pressure. But as you start drawing it down, when you've got the trigger pressed on your plasma cutter, the pressure is going to continue dropping, and then the motor will come on the compressor, but it won't be able to keep up. So eventually it's going to drop down, and the plasma cutter, the Hypertherm plasma cutter, and most other brands, has the pressure switch. It'll just shut off. It'll stop cutting mid-cut. Release the trigger. Go eat a sandwich. Don't have a beer if you're plasma cutting. But you're going to have to wait. So, and I've done it myself. I had some work I had to do down in my horse barn. I had to cut a bunch of galvanized metal. We're doing some roofing, and my shop compressor is a little bigger than this in my shop. It's 800 feet away from my horse barn.
He doesn't want to move that.
Yeah, so I've got a little nail gun compressor, even smaller than yours.
Oh, wow.
And on 26 gauge roofing material, I could actually cut about 20 or 30 feet.
Just with that.
Because you're cutting very fast on thin material.
Definitely.
But if I was cutting some half-inch steel, I might only get a foot into the steel before I had to wait for the compressor to catch up.
So what you're saying is pretty much any air compressor should be able to run a plasma cutter, but if you got a smaller one, you're going to be fine for some super short cuts that don't demand much air, or if you're doing thicker stuff, you're just going to have to wait. Is that what I'm taking away from it? Cool.
Exactly.
So when I went and bought this beast, I would say this is probably like a light commercial-ish compressor, something like that. I don't think I'd really call it industrial grade, but this is more serious than the average guy's going to put in his basement or whatever. I know some people, some among us, have found really good deals on industrial compressors used. Do you have any insight to share on that?
Yeah, well, okay, quickly though, the difference between what I would call an industrial compressor and And this one, this is good for a small shop for limited use, and certainly it's probably a little overkill for most hobby shops. This is a 60 gallon, it's 12.8 CFM, 3.5 horsepower. The very first thing,
220 volt.
yeah, don't buy a compressor just on its horsepower rating.
Yeah.
And that's because the manufacturers are allowed, actually by law, to lie a little bit about the rating of the compressor.
Yeah, so I don't mean to interrupt you. My little tiny Makita says it's a 3 horsepower motor, and this is 3.5, and this puts out almost 2.5 times the air that one does.
Your Makita runs on
110.
Yeah, well, you can't get 3 horsepower out of a 110 volt outlet.
Tell it, not me.
There's not enough wattage and amperage there to do it. So,
definitely.
So, but what they do is they rate it based on what they call locked rotor amperage draw, and then they calculate the horsepower from that. That's when the motor stalls, and if it stays stalled for very long, smoke's going to start coming out of it. So they're allowed by federal law to rate it on the locked rotor rating of the motor.
Which doesn't really help the average person unless they're going to stall
So bottom line, don't buy a compressor. A bigger horsepower doesn't necessarily mean anything.
Okay.
But when you get up into industrial compressors, it does. They don't lie when you're buying a $2,500 compressor.
Yeah.
So the other thing that's different is most of the, once again, this is a good size compressor, but this motor runs at 3,450 RPM. It's called a high-speed compressor. By spinning the compressor pump faster, you can get a little bit more volume out of it. The problem is when you spin it twice as fast, it's going to last half as long. So the math is probably pretty simple, but for hobby shop use or lower duty cycle use, it's going to last plenty longer. I had a compressor very similar to this that I bought something like 30 years ago. It actually lasted about 25 years, and I worked it on and off, hobby shop type use. I did find though on Craigslist, I found a really nice Kellogg industrial compressor, and I bought it for a song. The difference is though, its motor runs at 1,750 RPM. You look at the pump is like massive, it's huge. And it doesn't have the pump actually spins even slower because the division from the pulleys that go to it.
It's slow.
I think my pump only spins at 600 RPM. And so it's quiet. And a pump that runs less often because it's more capacity on the output produces less heat and less water. So there's some advantages to it. But once again, if you bought my compressor new, once again, you'd have to buy it from a company like Granger's or someplace like that.
It'd probably be
the big tip off is the RPM of the motor. And it's probably in the $2,500 range, or maybe even more. So.
Yeah, I've scored some Craigslist deals on some cool stuff. Looked around last night compressor wise, and there just wasn't anything easily found, so I figure if you're looking for a good deal on a used compressor, industrial size, or really anything from a site like that, I'm guessing you pretty much have to just watch it and check it like every day or a couple times a day. And when
you have to be very patient if you're looking for used equipment. You also have to know what you're looking at, because you could buy a piece of junk and that's not worth anything. So, but once again, it's a great site. I tend to buy equipment there. I know you do as well. But you got to know what you're looking at, and be patient.
So to paraphrase, you're saying if possible, it would be really good to track down a good used industrial compressor. Otherwise, something like this for about what I paid for it would be good for, hobby shop, smaller shop type work, maybe some agricultural stuff, you farmers out there, that kind of thing. But one of the main things that differentiates a compressor like this, which is a little bit on the lighter side from a true industrial unit like yours, is the speed of the motor. 3450 is the smaller ones, which I'm sure is a lot less than the one this one replaces, because that thing really hums. But that seems like a pretty good deal to me. You really know your plasma cutters. Jim knows a lot about a lot of things. And do you have anything else you'd like to add?
Nope. I think we're in pretty good shape. This very often asked questions are about the air systems for plasma cutting, and I see a lot of people don't buy plasma cutters because they think the air system is going to cost them a lot. It can, but it doesn't have to. So
you can get by with not much. I ran that little thing for a year and a half or something. Probably close to 2 years now. So, all right, that sounds good. We got a lot covered. You guys have earned yourselves a cookie if you watch this video all the way through. So a big thank you to the one and only Jim Colt. I'm really glad to have you here in the shop. And thanks for watching again. Thank you to Jim and Dave, the regional hypertherm man behind the camera here. And yeah, we're gonna make some more cool plasma cut videos for you guys. So have fun, stay safe, yeehaw.